Hi there. So in this lecture, we're going to cover the JavaScript scope. And I think there is a very common factor where we get confused on how different variables work and how the scope of things should be. So let's try to make things clear. In JavaScript, objects and functions are also kind of variables. Scope is basically a set of variables, and if objects and functions are also kind of variables, which means scope is the set of variables, objects and functions you have access to. Now, JavaScript has function scope, which means the scope changes inside functions. What happens is, variables declared within a JavaScript function become local to the function. Local variables have local scope. They can only be accessed within the function. Let's try and see an example. Let's create a function my function, and let's give a variable name is equals to Abhay. We have this function. Now let's call this function. Now what this function will do, it will call Abhay and it will print out console.log from within the function plus name. Let's go to the console, close the output. Let's run this example and see. So you can see that from within the function Abhay, let me fix the typo and run it again. Okay, so here we are. So very plain simple function that we wrote that will display the name and will use the variable created in that function. Now what will happen if I try to use the variable name outside the scope of the function? Let's try to do the same thing outside the scope of the function. Let's remove this and just see name. Now let's go and run this, and you can see the output is JSBin output. What does that mean? It means that it's undefined. As we are playing around in JSBin, this gives us an output string of JSBin output, and you can see there's a space and there's nothing beyond it, which means this is a default string that the JSBin provides, and after that it means that the variable value was undefined. Name cannot be fetched outside the scope of the function. Now what can we do about it? Firstly, this is the local scope for a particular variable, so any variable inside the function has a local scope. To make it a global scope, which means if there are two functions, let's say my function 2, for example, my function 2, and for this function to have another name, let's try to run my function 2 and see. And let me just comment this. Let's clear the console. Let's run. You can see this is Abhay and this is John. Again, I have two different variables with the same name. So it doesn't matter if you have the same name variable inside multiple functions. This shows that the scope or the lifespan of a variable inside a function is very local. So the variable gets created when you declare it inside a function and gets deleted when your function is done, which means inside the scope of these parentheses. So that's a local scope. Now what if I want to use the same variable throughout without actually creating a new variable? That is something called as a global variable. The way we create it is we define it outside at the top level. When you do name, you don't have, and let's try to run again. Let me show you a fault out here. So if you try to run again, it will still show you Abhay and John, and it did not complain anything about the variable. Now, when you try to access name outside the scope, which is this, it will still give you the JSBin output. You can see this, which means it's still undefined. What does that mean? It means that the moment you create a global variable, irrespective if you create a variable of the same name inside the local scope, that takes precedence and it's treated as a local variable. Now, how can we make sure that we use a global variable? Well, the answer is very simple. We just remove this new declaration so that we are just reassigning the value to the global scope. Now let's try to run it and you will see the difference. You can see it was initially Abhay, then it became John, and then the final value was John because there's nothing after it. Now what if I run my function once again after function 2? Well, the name will be Abhay because that's what we set after that. Do you see the difference? That was the global scope in JavaScript. What happens with the global scope variables in HTML? Let's quickly close this console and open the output. You can see that I have a p tag which just defaults that in this lecture we'll go over the scope. I have another p tag which says global scope. This is just a placeholder p tag that I have kept in. What I mean, the moment you create a document, and what I mean by a document, you can just right click and do a view source. Well, not on this one. View page source. What this will do is it will give you a set of HTML tags. You can see this. So what this is a document, and that's what you say. The doc type is an HTML and this is a document. Now when we create a JavaScript global variable, what it means is that you can access it using the Windows keyword. Let's see an example before we go ahead. So let's just do document dot get element by ID, and I think we have done this plenty of times now, so it should be easy. Scope, close this, set the inner HTML is equals to I can display. Oh, it started displaying. And let's try to put in the global variable using the window. So window dot name, and I can display Abhay. Did you see that? And it all came from the window, and I did not set anything in HTML. However, I can use the global variables in HTML context if I need to. So that's how you can talk to JavaScript and the HTML code. Now you may think that if global variables have such a vast access, why can't I just create all my variables to be global? Well, there's a downfall to it. So imagine if you have like 500 lines of JavaScript code and you have different functions, different logic written in there, and you have variables which are global scope, you will not know when, in what order, and what the value is set to. Like we saw in this example, I call the functions 3 times. And the function has value Abhay, then next it goes to John, and then it gets Abhay again. So if I change the order, or probably it's if I remove a call, the value will be different on when I access it. So it gets very difficult to trace them, and as a good practice, you should only create global variables if you explicitly need them. Otherwise, the local variables should do the cause. Now the lifetime of a JavaScript variable starts when it is declared. Local variables are deleted when the function is completed. Global variables are deleted when you close the page. So your global variables will not go away till the time you close your HTML page. One more important thing is when you give parameters to a function. Let's say I give a parameter of age. Age by default becomes a local scope variable, which means I cannot access age outside the scope of this method. So that was all about the scope in JavaScript. I think it is a very important concept that you need to get familiar with. Go back to the video. If you don't understand it, you can definitely ask me in the Q&A section too. See you in the next class.